to see here. I think quite a few more will pour in as we begin, which tells us we're really touching on a really important topic here, around a question of how do we think about design and cities with regards to where we are in the world today and what the world will look like tomorrow. We've got some amazing speakers. Maybe before I start, I'll introduce myself. My name is Danny Almagor. I run the Small Giants Academy. I know many faces here, and I'm saying hi to many of you who are good and old friends, and some new friends, and some friends I look forward to connecting to over time as well. Liv, George, I just want to put that slide back up again. I'll just share what's happening, what happened before this and what's happening after. My background, by the way, is engineering. So although I was an aerospace engineer, I've been very, very passionate about cities, about design, construction and property development. And that's really how this series came about, in conversation with one of our guests, Paul Hameister, who's also incredible. We'll be hearing from today, a former lawyer, investment banker, property developer, but really those things are probably the least interesting of his personas. He is an adventurer, someone who has climbed all the highest peaks in all the continents in the world, Everest and others, hiked to the North and South Pole, has done some of the most incredible nature-based adventures of anybody I have ever met. And he's also passionate about the future of cities, particularly nature-based cities, and started a non-profit trying to promote the idea as in the property industry and generally in design and cities. How do we bring nature back into our cities? And we also have Amanda Sturgeon. Amanda is an architect, or was an architect in her past career, an author, incredible books, speaker. She's done amazing TED Talks, so much you can read about and learn from Amanda, and now the CEO of the Biomimicry Institute with, of course, the legend Janine Benyus. And very much has brought her architecture background and design background into this idea of how do we think about and design the future of our cities, of our planet, particularly again in the face of climate change and adaptation and all these things. I am calling in from Melbourne. I'm at home. I actually just got some baby chickens this morning, so I left work to make sure that they've got enough food in their little box. The lands of the Bunurong people. If you want to tell us where you're calling in from, we've got people from all over the world. You're welcome to put it into the chat. It's always nice to see where people are calling in from all around Australia, all around the world. But we don't have that much time, so I want to get into it and see if we can get started. So Amanda and Paul, welcome to the webinar series. We did the previous one we had last time, and Paul was there, and we're going to have another one coming up in a couple of weeks with Lisa Miller. But today we're going to focus in, particularly Amanda, on your work around biomimicry and this question around, a lot of people obviously have signed up to this because they've read about you, they know about the work of biomimicry, but maybe just to catch everyone up, how might we understand biomimicry as a concept?
Yeah, well, thanks, Danny, and hi, everybody. Excited to be here and to have this conversation. Paul and I have also been having some great conversations about how we might bring nature into cities as well. So looking forward to it. But yeah, to start with biomimicry, well, I guess you could say that biomimicry is asking nature's advice. It's turning to nature to understand the kinds of strategies, functions, systems that it has in play that have learned to adapt and evolve to various different conditions and situations over 3.8 billion years, and understand what we can learn from that. There's three aspects. I think many times people jump right to the mimicry part, and it's like, oh, so we're just taking it for humans' use and kind of mimicking it. But really, it's firstly about reconnecting. So reconnecting that wonder about nature's brilliance, firstly. The second is really about then how might we emulate that to both solve it's traditionally been design challenges, but could also be leadership, social cohesion, any sort of question you might have. There's an answer in nature somewhere. And then thirdly, it's about an ethos, which is building that sort of ethics and relationship, deep relationship with nature and understanding it. And just as, indigenous cultures have not lost that deep connection with nature and systems, many of us have. So more than anything, for me, it's about reawakening that connection and reestablishing it.
And Paul, biomimicry for you, what does it mean?
Well, Amanda and I have had this conversation before. The mimicry word bothers me because it kind of talks to trickery a little bit, just a little bit, Amanda. And I mean, we are vibrational energy with a consciousness. I mean, open to challenge on that, but at its essence, and I think we all feel how our vibrational energy changes when we're in nature. The energy kind of syncs with the vibrational energy of the living mass around us, whether, and that could be in the middle of the Sinai where I've been, as you know, and in the Amazon, in the polar regions or up high. But you just feel different when you are immersed in nature and there's no man-made or human-made, I should say, intrusions. But we live in these cities where we surround ourselves with concrete and glass and human-made structures, and it messes with our vibrational energy and the way we feel. And we've got generations of kids growing up in cities with no kind of direct experience with nature. So, yes, I think replicating nature as best we can is a really important step in our urban environments. But we need to go the step further. It needs to be real nature. There needs to be living landscape. There needs to be trees. There needs to be green open space. People need to be able to immerse themselves in it. So I think, that there's a big nature piece in biomimicry, but in biophilia, and we've tested this with our consultant teams and in our projects, it talks to things like the shape of buildings and the materials you use and flowing water. But they're human creations. That's not actually real nature. I don't know if you want to respond to that, Amanda, kind of without notice, bit of a poke.
Sure, provocation. Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think, I started my career right in architecture and really trying to figure out that relationship between the places where humans do spend 90% of their time, which is in buildings, and the natural world, and how we might, make that interface happen in a meaningful way. And I think there are many ways to do that. Absolutely, direct nature immersion is I think what is best, if you like, for us to reestablish that relationship. But the reality in the many office buildings with little daylight, and it's a privilege, right, to go out into the wilderness to be able to do that. So how do we make that something that everybody can rebuild that reconnection to? And I think there's so many layers by which you do that. One is just simply having simple things that should be intuitive to all of us, like natural daylight and ventilation, but others is, having access to actual nature, especially where it's densest. So, I've done work, a lot of work in biophilia. I've done work in the nature of city space and in biomimicry, and for me, they're all kind of part of the same set of objectives: that reconnection between people and nature, that acknowledgement that we are nature, we're not separate from it. And they're just kind of different manifestations of how we go about reawakening, reconnecting. So I love them all, and I like to practice and move between all of them, which often confuses people because they can't pin me down as a biomimetic or a biophilic or a nature of cities person. I'm all of it. I mean, I'm across it all. As long as we have more connection between people and nature, it's all good to me how that manifests, I guess. Yeah.
I think I might have stirred the hornet's nest too. I'm getting smacked up in the comments things. I think Barry just gave me a smack as well.
I love it. Biomimicry is not biomimicry. Somebody said that's great, Jane.
That's right.
But it's an interesting question because it's I like the the nuance that you're saying, Paul, that there is this idea that, and you said in the beginning, Amanda, what we can learn from nature. Like I'm an engineer, aerospace engineer, so we can look to birds to try and understand flight so that we can create more aerodynamic wings or whatever it is. That's one part of it, and I think that's what you were saying, Paul. That's good, but that's not at the essence. That's not the philosophy. Isn't what can we learn from nature for ourselves. Amanda, what you're bringing is it's all of it, right? It's all those elements of what does leadership mean, what does connection to nature mean. Can we expand this idea of biomimicry from an R&D innovation lab, right, to actually a philosophy. But before we get into that, and everybody, if you want to write questions in the chat, it's hard for me to keep up with all the questions, but write them in the chat. And we've got Liv who is hosting us here in the background, and she'll have a look and shoot them to the center if when we go to questions. But before we jump into the philosophy of this stuff, which I think is really deep, I'd love to see some examples. What are some of the things that you've seen, whether it's in that biomimicry, like the shape of buildings, the examples from nature, or on that biophilia, like on both of those elements, where we brought Paul, as you sort of said, brought nature into our lives, or brought our lives back into nature, maybe a better way of describing it. So what are some of the examples you've seen, particularly in cities? Like we're talking about the future of cities, and a lot of people on the call are designers, are developers, are thinkers about the future of cities. What have you seen as examples, particularly good examples, of this type of thinking? Amanda, you wrote a book about this. Oh, maybe you start and then I'll shoot to Paul.
Yeah, well, I mean, I also did some work with the Committee for Sydney in creating Nature Positive Sydney, which goes kind of really about also creating some practical steps for how we might actually create a nature positive city, and worked with World Economic Forum's Bio Commission on basically bio cities, looking globally at how we might realize them. So I think, from my perspective, great examples lie in cities like Singapore, where, the inclusion of nature is a requirement in development. And, that can sometimes have some unintended consequences. I was just in a workshop actually with Centre for Livable Cities in Singapore in London. And they were sharing stories of where monkeys are stealing people's laundry from the balconies, and there's sort of some unintended consequences sometimes of that, really bringing that nature people connection in, that causes us to really question that relationship, which I think is fantastic. But yeah, Singapore is a great, I think, case study from my perspective of what that might look like. And I also think, we've had some great examples of buildings that have done it in isolation. But where I love also where biomimicry's been going, there's a project called Project Positive that I run the nonprofit side, Biomimicry Institute, and we have a sister B Corp called Biomimicry 3.8. They have an initiative called Project Positive that's been looking at how might we emulate the ecosystem services of a denser place like a city, and start to have the building really work much harder to clean water, for example, to provide some of the ecosystem services that place might provide, as well as to provide actual nature. In my days as an architect, what I would often see in the landscaping gets left to the end, and then the budget gets cut, and a few little trees get stuck around the edge that look pretty sorry for themselves after the first 2 years. So it's not just about adding trees. It's about actually looking at the ecosystem services. For me, you need understory. You need a mix of sort of ecology in a city to enable all kinds of species to thrive. And I think that's where looking at what ecosystems would be there, how might they perform. It's where the role of biomimicry, I think, provides a deeper lens. What might mutualisms look like for us to support not just a few trees to help people with shade or that connection, but also to help insects thrive, that can allow the lorikeets to thrive, that can allow the flying foxes in Sydney to survive, and how do we create those conditions for the more than human life in our cities? it's going to take some effort, just like the monkeys in Singapore, for us to be comfortable sometimes with those relationships in denser environments, and to share our space and our laundry with other species. But yeah, there's a lot of examples, I think, of like small pieces, of regeneration. I mean, I'm thinking about, if we look overseas, the little island project in Manhattan, that just takes some piers and created essentially this place for people and nature. I mean, Regen Melbourne, as you know, is doing fantastic work, swimmable rivers, more swimming areas in Sydney, for example. So it doesn't just necessarily look like bringing in trees, although that's great. It can also look like us being able to inhabit different ecosystems and be in relationship with them.
Yeah, no, I noticed Tony said, nature in cities, not just vegetation, exactly what you were saying. It's nature services, our reconnection to the waterways, habitat, other things. One of the things I love, you're talking about examples. I once got to visit the Green School and the Green Village in Bali. For those who haven't, Google it. It's one of the most inspiring developments, I guess. It's a little village all made from bamboo. An extraordinary, and being there, you feel it. You feel like, you're genuinely part of the forest, living in these very beautiful homes. But Paul, what have you seen? What are some of the examples that inspire you, or maybe that even you've been a part of?
Uh, yeah, I'm picking up on Amanda's theme. You know, our experience and our landscape architects that sit on our teams, their experience is that the landscape always comes last. And to quote them, it ends up being the parsley on the pig in urban development. And so what we set out to do with part of nature-based cities and the not-for-profit, and this is not an advertorial, but it talks directly to this question, Danny, is try and create a framework for what nature-based or biophilic excellence means as a guide for consultant teams before they start the design process. Because if you don't design the nature in at the start, it doesn't end up in there. And so we benchmarked a bunch of rating tools globally, all the rating tools locally, and kind of projects that had demonstrated nature-based design excellence, and came up with kind of 10 criteria that measure minimum amounts of vertical greening, horizontal greening, tree retention, new tree planting, green open space. But also, to Amanda's point, involving an ecologist in the process up front in a local context, to make sure that the planting is not just ornamental, that it serves a secondary purpose to support biodiversity. And the Singapore example is an interesting one, because it's really easy to do lots of green in those cities, because the plant species support it. It's much harder in different climates, but we've tried to create a framework and a guide that, and with an input from ecologists, can be applied anywhere and in any city, because there is no standard globally yet as to what nature-based excellence means as a reference point for a design team. So we've kind of tried to have as best a go as we could by involving as many consultants as we could, and Amanda kind of reviewed that for us as well. I'm very grateful for her expertise and input. And I was going to segue into one bit of feedback you gave us in that process, which talks to the monkeys, which is, nature is messy, and humans don't like mess. And so if you make a big investment in living landscape, who's going to maintain it? And that's one of the reasons why local councils don't like too much nature, because it's messy, and they've got to hire people to look after it, and it causes problems, and people trip over on things. And I don't know if you've got a perspective on that, Amanda, you'd like to share, but I think it's one of the big barriers to more nature in cities is actually the perception that maintenance is a hassle.
Yeah, and in many building codes, someone was pointing out to me the other day, it's actually required that, pests and nature cannot enter, like you're actually sealing the building so that no nature can get in, so it's sort of mandated often. Yeah, I live in Kuchi, just along the sort of regenerated wetland area between sort of, the ocean really, and then the start of the city. And yeah, that results in us getting a lot of bugs and a lot of loud birds and a lot of frogs. um, and there's definitely resistance. Trees are messy, their branches fall, their, fruit is all over the car. And, I think there's a huge behavioral change that needs to happen to accept that and to celebrate that. And to, see that as joy versus annoyance. But it's hard because we've been trained to kind of, not like that, want more sterile environments. And, this sort of sense of cleanliness or hygiene is very dominant. So we've definitely got a huge barrier to leap over to sort of get that acceptance in cities in particular.
Yeah, and I mean, even as you were saying that, I was thinking, yeah, fruit trees on the nature strip and stuff, and then there's this argument that it creates a lot of mess and will attract, rodents or possums, and but even like just walking barefoot or like dog-friendly areas, like it's interesting how we're creating that hygiene, that sterility, um, is increasing. Paul, I wanted to come back to something you said because you talked about some tools, right? And I love, your mind is also thinking, you know, sequentially, how do we create the right tools to encourage this? One of the questions from earlier on, Madhukar, I think it is, was writing, are there any AI-based tools which help in this work on biomimicry? And it made me think of the idea of artificial intelligence as opposed to sort of nature's intelligence or animal intelligence. And so I guess I wanted to ask just on that tools, how is technology and generally and in particular AI, is it playing any role in this work or in this thinking? And are you guys incorporating it at all?
I'll do my segue to Amanda because and Amanda's got a much more interesting answer than mine. Mine's just a provocation. You know, and I think I mentioned this last time, but not one of Australia's ESD rating tools has a mandatory requirement for any living landscape. So you can have a world best in class 6-star Green Star rated building that's concrete and glass. We're trying to solve a massive problem facing our species and the planet using our brains.
Yeah.
And this year alone in Australia, 60,000 tons of old solar panels are going to landfill. We're trying to fix it with our brain. And then we're going to try and create some artificial version of our brain and then hand over control to fixing the problem. That scares the absolute shit out of me. I'm going to hand over to Amanda.
Yeah, well, I think I'm often someone that says if only we could quiet our human cleverness, So I use that a lot. And yes, the thought that we're now trying to, duplicate our cleverness and scale our cleverness is a worry, for sure. I think, the approach we've taken at the Institute is kind of to try to jump on AI to some extent and try to ensure that there are models there that are actually nature focused, nature forward, I guess you could say. So we are working actually on a tool called Chat Nature at the moment that we're going to release in the coming months. And we have imitated the beautiful voice of Janine Benyus, our founder. And if you haven't listened to her, I know Barry did a wonderful podcast with her. And, she's like the voice of nature, like the way that she can talk about, the brilliance of nature and communicate it. So we've basically channeled Janine's voice through the various different field guides that she's written, as well as the Biomimicry book, into the back end of Chat Nature, so that you can ask a question essentially kind of like of Janine in some ways, and you can get a credible, accurate, scientific, if you like, sort of answer around how would nature do something or how would nature solve this challenge. I think the reason we jumped into that space is because we see a lot of people jumping into that space, especially around nature. And we felt that it was important to actually have, if you like, a sort of North Star of what that could look like. So we've made an attempt. We've done it pretty much on a shoestring, kind of like budget, and And we're going to be putting it out there for people to pilot fairly soon, in typical nonprofit fashion. So I mean, I think it's a scary space, but I think it's also a space that we do need to jump into with some level of, I guess it would be from the biomimicry perspective, the ethos, which is how we talk about having ethics and morality, and that relationship around nature being based on that foundation. So I think that's very much the way we've sort of approached AI at the moment. How do we pivot it to be something that can actually give us access to more knowledge? We used to share that knowledge through stories, and still that happens in intact indigenous communities, but we've now got billions of people disconnected from nature. Can we use AI to help reconnect them, to get them access to nature's brilliance more easily so that they can reawaken that connection? I don't know. That's a question, really. Not that we've got an answer, but perhaps, yeah.
Random thought. Could we program that all the AI back of house with indigenous wisdom?
Yeah.
I was thinking actually it's called a large language model. Could it be a large nature model? Instead of training it on Twitter and the internet and like human information, I don't even know how you do this, but what would that look like? And that question,
Yeah.
I love what you brought up, Amanda, about cleverness or intelligence, and I always contrast that with the idea of wisdom, and where does that come from? Maybe Paul, as you said, that comes from some of our ancient traditions, that are holding some of those more, I guess, embodied ideas of what it means to be, a being in relation to the world. But which leads me maybe to Barry's question. How important or relevant is the inner personal work in changing our lens towards biomimicry and biophilia? So obviously there are tools, there are practical things, there are methodologies, but look how quickly we move to the inner world, to the idea, to the concept of ideas and paradigms, and even dare I say, sacredness of the relationship that we have. So how, for both of you, maybe on a personal level, even, what brings you into this world from your own inner world?
Well, I feel like Paul's got all these profound, like, adventure experiences in nature that he could share with all of you. That I'm sure mine pale in comparison, um, but I would say for me, very early on, nature is my sort of spiritual guide. It is very sacred to me. It is what sort of guided both my personal, my work life, the vision of hope that I continue to have for the world. And yeah, that happened quite early on in my life through a series of different events. And I think I've wanted to kind of bring that sort of connection to others. I agree that it's very much about a deeper interpersonal connection. I'm sure many of the people on this call, and I know many people in the biomimicry realm too, it's built on that. It's built on that ethos and that ethic and that real sort of deep gratitude and connection. And it's such a gift, right? It's such a gift to be able to have that. I think the big question for me has been, I've done thousands of workshops with people where I start with an awakening, if you like, of, share with your neighbor the most profound experience you've had in nature that's really shaped you. And we've had everything from people being face to face with a cougar to, I just, sat on my balcony in Manhattan and used to make shapes out of clouds. So I think everybody has that connection. Sometimes it's a glimmer, and sometimes it's a bright light. And it is, I think, the work that we all have to do, which is why I love the work with Small Giants, which is, it's not just about the knowledge, it's also about that inner work, that connection with others, and with the world, the the non-human, more than human world that we're part of. So for me, it's foundational. And I don't know, Paul, you've got some wonderful stories to share, I'm sure.
No, I wasn't going to share any of them actually. I was going to I was it to use your word, it's foundational. Like it's absolutely central to our species making the transition to a more sustainable, more nature orientated world, which is the the destruction, or at least the softening of this illusion of separateness. And it's the illusion of separateness, which is a creation of ego, which makes us think that we are separate from and above. And if we can fix that, we'll fix everything else. And you have no awareness that that is even a thing if you haven't done the inner work, to your point, Danny. If you haven't done inner work, you look at you talk about the illusion of separateness. Everyone's like, what are you talking about? We are separate. I'm the center of the universe. What are you talking about?
Yeah, far out. Like I feel like I'm inside screaming a bit here because, and I don't know if others are. You can do this if you're feeling what I'm feeling, because it's almost like what you're saying, and it so deeply, of course, resonates. Is like it's almost like if we come to this from an intellectual exercise, from a strategic mindset, it's like, okay, well, how does this thing work, and how do we solve for it? But what we're really saying is it has to come. It's almost like a plant. It doesn't fall from the sky. It grows from the earth, and like this work has to come from an inner dimension. Like if we're not feeling connected to nature, it's almost like there are no roots. It hasn't come from the earth. It's just been dropped, and I don't know. That's just what's coming up for me, and it becomes much more of a conversation not about our connection to nature, but what have we lost? Like, how have humans disconnected so far from nature, from each other? And maybe I want to bring in Nick. Is a beautiful question there around, just pulling it back up here. Um, in terms of designing spaces, talking about that loneliness epidemic. It's almost like it feels like all these things are connected: biophilia and the future of cities, loneliness, climate change. Like it's almost like we've always had this idea of the outer and the inner are separate, or the mind and the body, or we sort of create this disconnection. But what Nick's asking is, you know, how does a built environment connect us back to ourselves, connect us back to each other in loneliness, connect us back to nature? Like it has to start with something inner, but then, what have you guys, what's he saying? What has been and can be done for nature to inform that built environment for that reconnection?
Yeah, well, I've come at it from many different angles in my time as an architect. I ended sort of when I was really in practice by having to translate it into human benefit terms in order for people to do it. And so trying to bridge in strategies, like I mentioned, in sort of having people actually question themselves around sort of their own connection. But then ultimately, yeah, it's, well, we can be more productive if we have an hour exposure in nature. Cities are cooler, that's factual. Air is cleaner, starting to translate it into sort of monetary values because our society is set up that way. And yeah, it felt like hard work doing that. It felt like, where the real question that we've just been talking about of like, but how do we really repair this relationship, was still being missed. And it was more about how do I get people with no relationship to do it anyway. And that's the place that a lot of architects, designers, planners are in, trying to sort of create a business proposition for it, versus thinking about that inner connection, and pulling on that thread, because it's often not as it doesn't often result in anything being included. except for the few, yeah, what was it, parsley on the whatever you said, Paul, that was a
The
good,
pig, yeah.
the pig, you know. So yeah, I think it's a long way to go on that rebuilding relationships. You know, I listened last year to Christiana Figueres, did a great, as part of that, her Outrage and Optimism podcast, did a great 3-part on nature. Why have we lost our relationship? And sort of traced it back to, you know, the start of the industrial era, how it was embedded in many sort of religious platforms that, you know, we are superior to, you know, and really looked sort of socially at how that's come about. And I think did a really good job at sort of, you know, connecting. We would not have been able to consume as much of nature in the way we have if we had not separated ourselves. We wouldn't have been able to have consumed as much. So in many ways, it allowed us to consume to the extent that we have and destroy to the extent we have. If we saw it as part of ourselves, we just wouldn't be able to do that. It becomes more and more difficult to. It hurts, right, when you see species becoming extinct, for example. So I don't know the answer to how we regain on a mass level that relationship. But I do think these efforts to bring more nature into the city, you know, you can't love what you don't see. So if there's no nature in the city, and there's no multi-species in the cities, and there's no relationships building just between you and the, you know, the lorikeets, or, you know, whatever it might be in your place, we don't have a chance of rebuilding it. So yeah, I feel like the work that Paul's doing to try to get it incorporated in everyday development is pretty critical.
Paul, can we hone in on that? Because I mean, Amanda said something earlier on about money, right? And the financialization of this work, and somebody in the chat also, you know, sort of seeing you really quite deep in the business world. You know, one part is let's you know, find the awe and beauty and wonder of nature, the connection back to, as Amanda, you know, when we were children and just loved, you know, climbing trees and watching birds and, you know, following ant trails and all these things, you know, that connects to that inner. But in the business world, and you know, I'm sort of in there, but I think you're even deeper in there. Um, you know, it's almost like that's left at the door. So how do we engage in that financialization of cities, of built environment with the mindset that you guys are bringing in here? How are you seeing that work? How do you speak to people in the corporate boardrooms about this?
So many layers to the question. Uh, I'll drop down to that in a sec. How do you shift globally and at a mass scale and change the way we think about our cities? There needs to be a major shift in spirituality towards a more nature-based mindset and philosophy, as opposed to some external, all-seeing, all-punishing kind of we are above, nature's a resource, as opposed to our spirituality being intertwined with, which is where our species kind of found its spirituality for all of time up until the Industrial Revolution. So drop down a layer, you know, we've been doing, you know, road shows with developers around the country talking about nature, which is a pretty unusual topic to bring developers together to talk about. And the interesting thing is, you know, and again, I'm going to jump around a bit, the illusion of separateness. How do we kind of fix that? I think it's a universal experience of humans that we spend the first half of life building ego and building that illusion of separateness. The second half of life, we end up trying to deconstruct it because we realize it doesn't serve us. And imagine if we kind of got the average age of the people on this call, I suspect they're probably, you know, mostly second half, because that's why they're here and that's why they're interested in it and why it matters. And it usually takes a, you know, punch in the face of something midlife to make you realize that there's more, must be more to this. And you go and search. So, you know, context, when I'm in boardrooms talking to developers about this, you raise the concept of spirituality. You can, out of 15 people, you can see 10 eyes light up, and the other 5 are like, oh fuck, how do I get out of here? Excuse my French. So but they're there, right? They're there. They just wear They wear a costume during the day, which is what they do for a living, but they're, who they are as a person is there. And then, it's about working within the system to change the system rather than trying to blow up the system to create change. And so, working with Amanda and other experts, it's about how do we use the system, particularly the ESD kind of rating frameworks, because developers want to tick boxes to change the outcomes. How do we change the regulatory frameworks? And then how do we show developers and the capital behind development and cities that there's money to be made in nature? Even if that's not what we actually care about, we know that's how you create change in this current system that we've got, that we have to live with for the time being, until there's a massive shift in kind of mindset and philosophy. So that's all the research we've been commissioning to demonstrate that there is financial return in investing in nature. And that's why every render that you see for a new apartment project is covered in green. It's rarely there at the end when it's built, but developers know nature sells, and it's about giving them the tools and the research to make better decisions up front in the process. And it kind of makes my skin crawl to even talk about that stuff to try and change behavior, but it's the only way we're going to get change in the current system while we wait for a bigger change.
Yeah, it's almost like a dual, one process is activate that sense of connectedness, that's, the sacred connection we have to nature. And the other one is just make it economically viable or unviable to build rubbish.
Yeah.
Right? And so you're sort of, playing both of those. Amanda, I'm interested in your thoughts on that, but particularly also what you've seen in your career of that change. Like Paul said, now speaking about spirituality or about nature or about our inherent connection to nature as opposed to the financial opportunity that this stuff does, more people are lighting up now in the boardroom than they might have been 10 or 20 years ago. Amanda, in your experience, have you seen this shifting in education, in policy, in government, in even in business?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, when I first really jumped into biophilic design, first one a few years before I put my, creating biophilic buildings book out, it was really because, I was working in the trenches of Living Building Challenge, which required some biophilic design, required people to think about buildings as living systems. And what I saw is people were kind of designing buildings exactly the same and trying to kind of add some stuff on to make it a bit greener. And I was really still like, how do I get to the root of this to shift the way they're designed in the first place? And as I started talking about, biophilic design and started bringing in some of the, health data and science, such as the 20% increase in productivity, numbers and no need for painkillers when you've got a hospital with a window to the outside, all of that data has been around for a while. Companies started to pay attention. Before we knew it, I convened a group of the biggest tech companies. I created biophilic framework in collaboration with Google and many other experts, and we put it in a Creative Commons as a tool. And there were other, Salesforce has a biophilic, space in the top of their tower in San Francisco, and Amazon has the bubbles in Seattle with spaces for people to come into to be in nature. So the tech sector, really jumped on board with that productivity component. As Paul was saying, well, you had to put it sort of in the translation of, well, for all of those companies, their biggest expense is their people. If they can get 20% more productivity, then it's a huge economic benefit for them. That's why they jumped on it. But at the same time, all the people in those rooms from those companies were the same as what Paul was saying, and that this is what they love to do. This is what lit them up in their work, and they loved to figure out how they could connect 10,000 people at a time in a space with nature. And so I think that started to change the conversation, because tech companies in our current moment of civilization have influence, as well as resources, and it started to mandate, especially in the States, a standard of what other companies would be looking for to compete for workforce, for example. In the tech sector, you've got to have some kind of, space where people can grow vegetables now, and you've got to have, a space where people can be outside, and you've got to have really great, natural daylight. And it sounds crazy that we wouldn't have had those things anyway, but office buildings were getting pretty dismal in there in the sort of late 80s, early 90s in particular. And so I think there has been a shift. I think it has been based on economics, being able to make that economic case. And, I was just talking, we're convening now a collab on building cities and infrastructure at the Institute. And I promise I'll do one in this time zone, but at the moment it's kind of US, Europe based. And we were just talking about adaptive cycles. They are incremental, they do evolve over time. That's what happens in nature. It kind of evolves, fairly incrementally until the small sort of interventions can shift the larger system, and then there's a revolt. And I think that's kind of what you were saying, Paul. I think there will be a revolt. But meanwhile, we're in this place where we're trying to put in these incremental things within the current paradigm and system. And we're kind of, I think someone put in the chat, that it's like sort of, getting the kids to eat the vegetables, but versus liking the vegetables or wanting the vegetables. We're just figuring out how to get the vegetables in, smoothies or whatever we can do, right?
Yeah.
So it's a bit like that for sure. I thought that was a great analogy. I'm going to use that one a lot. And I think we're trying to just figure out how to get it in the current system, knowing that the value paradigm isn't there yet. But I do think the revolt to a different way of doing it is not far away, personally.
We've got to have the base for it for future generations growing up in cities. And so we've got 2/3 of humanity living in cities pretty soon. And we got these generations of kids growing up in the cities. If they don't have any direct experience or connection with nature, and Amanda mentioned it before, they don't care about it. So it's impossible. It'll be too far gone to make that spiritual shift. So all we can do now in the current system is the best we can to get as much nature and living landscape into our urban environments and green spaces, so that there is a chance for that generation to make that shift spiritually.
Yeah. It's I mean, so, oh, sorry, Amanda, were you going to jump in?
No, I'm just nodding in agreement.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Paul, that idea of, that a part of our lives is about the me, building our own career, our own, sort of sense of self. And then we sort of shift into more of a giving part. There's a great book called The Second Mountain by David Brooks, speaks about that. But I think what I'm hearing is how do we accelerate that? Like, how do we not wait for people to have, some kind of a, midlife crisis or life-threatening, cancer scare that sort of wakes you up to, oh my God, life isn't just about me, it's about something bigger than me. So there's this question, and it brought me to Anthony wrote something about compassion earlier on, and a question that came to me from I can't find it immediately, but a question came: how do we design for compassion? Like, how do we, what we're talking about is connection, falling in love with the world, falling in love with nature, falling in love with each other, not just what it seems to be we all fall in love with ourselves, and our mobile phones, which just are mirroring, it just tells me what I want to know next. That's what the algorithm does to keep me there, or just gets me angry. But how do we design for compassion? Right, to Anthony's question, it reduces that self-orientation. So how do we bring that in? Is there a biomimicry sort of mindset there?
Yeah, I mean, it does get to the ethos that we talk about quite a bit in terms of that moral compass, that ethical compass to, be in relationship with natural systems, to have that curiosity. I think it would be interesting to explore, does that sort of, increased curiosity and learning about nature, help us on that journey for that spiritual connection and that compassion? I mean, it's a very good question. I think, increasingly we see beautiful examples of when you provide rich nature, especially in cities, you see the kinds of relationships that build between people, from growing food together to being able to just you know, meet each other, and when so the dogs are running around in a green space, you know, all the way through to you know, relationships we might have with interspecies. I think you know, that can build compassion. But too often, yeah, our compassion is sort of based on people to people. Not that that's not a good thing as well, rather than people to more than humans. And I think there's a lot of space there for us to be growing spaces for that connection. You know, Biomimicry 3.8, as I mentioned, our sister organization has done biomimicry immersions, taking people for 5 days and observing different ecosystems, understanding the different patterns, and creating a curriculum. You know, hundreds of people have had their lives profoundly changed. I mean, it's the same with any outdoor experience. The sort of safaris that you all do, I'm sure you see that profound change in people. But how can we go beyond that sort of once in an opportunity to something everybody can access? Big question, and something we are exploring. And in the Buildings Collab, I've brought together sort of 20 people that myself and couple of my board members we've worked with over the last, you know, sort of 15 years, 20 years, who've all been trying to do this in buildings. And we basically said, can't do the same things we've been doing. So how are we going to figure this out? Can we look at adaptive cycles? You know, can we look at panicies? Can we look at different systems in nature to figure out how you create this revolt? I think we've got a lot more questions in biomimicry than we might have answers, but we also feel like looking to nature helps us, you know, find some of those answers.
Yeah, I think we need an intervention in the education system, a big one. I mean, it's designed. It's a system designed for the industrial era, and it's way out of date. And I think if we make some big changes there and embed nature and nature experience and the importance of biodiversity and teach systems and systems thinking that we are part of a system, I think that will kind of be a good seeding of future generations and a shift.
Yeah, I like that. It's almost, we need a fundamental shift in the framework or the paradigm. It's almost like the story that we tell ourselves about who we are kind of sets in motion education, you know, government, society, etc. And you're almost saying we need to recenter ourselves in that connection. I want to just focus. We've got a few more minutes left, but take it to action. And we've got a great question here from Katya and a follow-on from Barry. Any thoughts on some of the practical things? What can we do to influence policymakers? Asked Katya to embed these concepts, and then Barry followed up with, what do we need to do to bring biomimicry into architects and engineers and designers? So essentially, we've got one on what can we do to bring this into policy and into education and design. What are some of the practical things? There are, you know, an extraordinary amount of people on this call who are passionate. You know, what are some of the things you could suggest that they can do to encourage this type of thinking in their worlds?
Yeah, well, I love seeing that people are in like planning and design advisory groups and you know, also, you know, in design spaces themselves. I mean, I think what people in those spaces can do is bring this into those meetings and conversations. Yeah, we are seeing some incredible policy, you know, particularly in the EU. We have a program actually not in the building space, but in the fashion waste space that's looking at how we mimic decomposition to deal with the mountains and mountains of fashion waste that are increasing every day, not slowing down, unregulated, completely out of control sector. And yeah, EU policies that are now going to be mimicked in California and New York State that basically, you know, limit waste exports of fashion and also require in-country solutions for waste management and responsibility for the retailers, are making an enormous, you know, sort of wave in that sector. I think, yeah, policies increasingly playing a role. I think it's, you know, I was talking with, you know, some of the folks in Singapore about how they've enacted some of the policies there. I think they've mostly been pretty effective as well. So there's definitely a role for policy, but I think the market has gone probably too far on these market-driven kind of solutions being the answer. If we just show the market that there's a standard or a certification, it will follow. And I think to some extent it gets it moving, but we need policy as well. And I think, as people have been putting in the comments, I mean, the reality is that we'll be seeing devastating floods, we'll be seeing stranded assets in cities. And many cities have responded, Seattle, Manhattan, many cities in China are creating sponge environments around the edges of their city. They're converting hard spaces into porous ones. They're regenerating their rivers, like in Melbourne, but many other cities as well, seeing them as assets, not things that need to be pumped underground. So some of that is being forced by these changing realities, which I think we will see more of. And action, I think also we formed these collabs at the Institute as a place to have, I think, these smaller salon conversations where you can bring people together to ask just those questions. And really explore, okay, what are the systemic sort of shifts and actions we can take here across sectors. So that's some of the exploration that we're doing, and I think more of those conversations are needed.
Yeah. Paul, some actions?
Well, there's two sides to the coin in our cities. One's the public realm, one's the private realm. And I'll put the public realm to one side. I think government councils are doing their best. Private realm is the bit that I kind of play in. And nature-based cities is our response to that. And it's about finding the gaps that exist that are needed to be filled to change behaviour, and then making it open source to the industry. So putting together a set of design guidelines that anyone can access and then give to a consultant team at the start of the project, creating these benchmarks, leading the ESD rating agencies where they need to go, and they're all in detailed conversation with us, and a couple of them are actively in discussions about adopting our tool and integrating it into part of their tool to talk to the nature piece that they're underdone on. So we're trying to work out where the gaps are for the tools to influence change, and then fill those gaps and then make it available for free. So if anyone's interested, go to the website .org.au. But what can we do as individuals on a much longer kind of time frame is just make sure we get our kids out into nature and understand how valuable it is, and put their phones down, turn the phones off, and try and create some level of connection at that level, I think. And I've certainly seen that with my kids, as you know, Danny, in the places I've taken them. They're just different people when they're in nature and they haven't got a phone, and it's profoundly impacted who they are as individuals now in their early 20s.
Yeah. Oh, I have to attest to that. Paul's got the most incredible children who are young adults, actually, who are not kids at all.
Yeah, but you're doing the same with your kids, right? I mean, it's just a choice as a parent.
We're in the world and trying to make a difference. Xavier, you asked any tips for people wanting to work in this space. My tip is to go and follow Amanda's work at the Biomimicry Institute, follow what Paul's doing at Nature-Based Cities, come along to more Small Giants Academy events. Our idea, of course, in this limited hour that we had with the amazing Amanda and Paul, join me in thanking them. Our limited hour was just to get the juices flowing. This is the beginning. This is not the end of that conversation. The conversation needs to be had in politics, needs to be had in education, with your children, as Paul said. We need to bring this into every space. If you can, stretch it to the sacred, stretch it to the connections. Guys, we have a lot more of these kind of conversations. We have another one coming up soon in a couple of weeks with Lisa Miller, who founded Wedgetail. She's going to talk about Wild Horizons and some of their work in rewilding. Again, how do we look at rewilding at a broad scale, but also bring it back into this concept of nature-based cities, which is really the focus of this 3-part webinar series. We also Paul mentioned systems thinking. We have different workshops and classes and conversations around different ways of thinking, really bringing very much, Amanda's very beginning conversation around different ways of leading, different ways of being, and different ways of learning into the world. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Amanda and Paul, for your wisdom and for your work in the world. And to all of you on the call, there's so much wisdom in you. We'd love to keep in touch with you, to see you again soon, and to work together to make this world a little bit greener and more connected. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Paul.